thank you everyone for attending my thesis defense. The title of my presentation today is, wait, am I sharing my screen? I am sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So the title of my thesis is Spectrum Management from License Rental and Bidding to Physical Layer. And in my talk, I will present a few projects that I worked on that are all aiming to bring some both theoretical and practical improvements to wireless spectrum utilization. So why is the spectrum utilization efficiency important? We all know of the growing problem of the spectrum scarcity. It's been a problem for decades and still is. And we can see two plots here from different years giving very similar kinds of predictions of spectrum demand and traffic growth in the following years. So the traffic growth does not seem to be ending, and spectrum is still a limited resource. Another important point is that obviously, since this has been a problem for decades, a lot of research has been focused on the problem of spectrum scarcity. And for a very long time, this research was mostly focused on increasing the bit rates, or specifically the throughput achievable per single spectrum unit. But today we have a growing number of heterogeneous wireless networks, and they tend to be operating in the same spectrum. And very few research papers have been published on how to make this cooperation and coordination in the same spectrum work. Even the protocols that tend to be cooperative, like Wi-Fi, for example, they're mostly reactive. So Wi-Fi will simply back off when it detects other spectrum presence, but it will not actively cooperate and coordinate spectrum access. So in the more recent years, research has been slowly shifting towards this spectrum access coordination, especially since all the efforts on increasing bit rates have recently been providing diminishing returns. So now with the coordination, there's, I would say, two main categories of approaches to this research, and those are the centralized spectrum coordination with an entity which would decide and coordinate this collaboration between mutual networks. This entity is usually called the Spectrum Access System, or SAS. And another approach would be the decentralized approach, where networks need to find ways to mutually communicate and coordinate spectrum access. With this spectrum shortage in mind and the directions of research recently, today I will be talking about several projects, as I mentioned. The first project is about centralized spectrum access coordination, so using SAS, and SAS will be utilized to design a secondary spectrum marketplace where license holders can rent out their licenses in very small, precisely defined geographical areas for a limited number of channels and for a very short amount of time. The second project I will be talking about is more of an engineering effort on how to implement a very efficient wireless physical layer that was ultimately used as part of the radio system that was built for the purposes of the DARPA Spectrum Challenge. I will also talk a little bit about the Spectrum Challenge itself, why it happened, and how it was designed. After that, I will move on to another aspect of the DARPA Spectrum Challenge, and that was the coordination protocol, or rather an interaction language built for the networks to exchange their spectrum usage information and intentions, and to use that to mutually coordinate spectrum access. I will then move on to spectrum coordination with SCMs, which is an IEEE standard to describe spectrum usage in a very precise way, which, other than simply describing spectrum usage, also facilitates determining the compatibility between given transmitters and receivers. And the final project I will present is whether we can use prediction, specifically short-term prediction, to determine spectrum availability, and how effective this method can or cannot be in certain scenarios. After that, I will conclude my talk. So as I said, the first project is focused on the secondary spectrum market, and specifically on renting the available spectrum licenses over smaller geographical areas and in very short periods of time. This project is focused on the three-tier spectrum sharing framework. So I will first introduce this framework. All the users in this framework are divided into three categories, with the incumbent users being the highest tier. Those are usually Navy, federal, military, satellite users who always must have unobstructed access to the spectrum whenever they need it. After that, we have the priority access license holders. These are usually larger networks such as Verizon, who obtain their spectrum licenses for a given region and specified number of channels, or rather the bandwidth they have available. And the third tier are the opportunistic users, called general authorized access, or GAA users. They can only utilize spectrum opportunistically when it's not being utilized by any of the users from the higher tiers. So what are the shortcomings of this approach? Mainly, the spectrum licenses are awarded for relatively large areas, such as entire counties, and for a long amount of time, for 10 years specifically. And with spectrum being such a scarce resource, networks are usually motivated to obtain the licenses as soon as they're available. And sometimes this would happen significantly before any actual physical deployment is planned. So in this case, an active license that was already obtained and paid for would not be utilized for a significant amount of time. So the solution to this would be to use micro licensing, or in other words, to rent this license out to interested parties in very limited areas and shorter amounts of time. FCC regulations already promote such markets, and they call them secondary spectrum markets. So how did I design this specific secondary spectrum market? It is basically an auction where interested parties would make their offers. Each offer or bid would need to, at the very least, include the monetary offer and the specific area where the spectrum access would be required. The actual assignment to the winning bids would be handled by the SAS, and SAS would basically be responsible for finding the optimal way to assign these sublicenses while avoiding any interference between them. So to go into a bit more detail, each bid, as I said, needs to specify the monetary offer, the required number of channels that the interested party needs, and the precise definition of the area. The SAS, when determining the final assignment, needs to exclude all interference, and the goal is to maximize the profit to the actual license holder, or alternatively to maximize the actual area that gets sublicensed. Other parameters such as license duration can be dictated by the market, but also some other potential parameters that may be used for further optimization are whether certain networks would allow coexistence with other networks in portion of their regions, or whether they would allow reduction of their areas in order to improve their chances of receiving the spectrum license. A natural and intuitive way to represent these bids and their overlaps in a map would be to use graphs. And in this case, a node of the graph would represent the bid itself. The weight of the node would be either the monetary offer or the size of the area that was required, depending on what the network would like to maximize. And the edge of the graph would represent an overlap between two territories. the most efficient assignment in this case is simply the maximum weighted independent set of this graph. However, the problem with this approach is that a simple graph will not capture the specific scenarios in which 3 or more areas would overlap. So as we can see in this figure on the right side, areas A, B, and C all overlap in a very small region, and the graph simply does not show this. So the solution here is to use hypergraphs, which are a generalization to graphs. Basically, a hyperedge can connect more than 2 nodes, and that is the main point here. However, the problem with hypergraphs is that their problems are usually even harder to solve than regular graph problems, and not enough research has generally been done in this topic. The properties of the hypergraph that I would use for my secondary spectrum market are shown here. So the node weights, as I said, would correspond to either the monetary offer of the bid or the area size, again, depending on what the license holder plans to maximize and optimize. The hyperedges are directed. And this means specifically in a case with 2 nodes that there would be an edge in each direction. So going from node A to B and going from node B to A. And the key in my algorithm is how edge weights are assigned. And the weight of an edge is basically the ratio of the size of the overlap between 2 regions and the entire area size of the source node. This means that with 2 corresponding edges going from A to B and B to A, one edge would have higher weight than the other. And this would represent that this area reduction, if it happened potentially, would be less detrimental to one of the nodes of the graph. In cases where more nodes overlap in a single region, a hyperedge would be defined to have 1 source node, and the destination would be the remaining set of all other nodes. Hypergraph, in the case of this,
Dragoslav, can you define less detrimental? More from practical perspective.
Yeah, so in this particular case, we have nodes A and B overlapping. And if we hypothetically wanted to assign licenses to both of them, we would need to get rid of this overlap. And reducing someone's area is definitely detrimental to either of the bids. But since the area is the same, it is less detrimental to the bid which has a larger area. Alternatively, depending on the spectrum market, we could define less detrimental as from the perspective of the license holder itself, in which case the portion of the area would be actually taken as the portion of the monetary offer. So in that case, we would pick another kind of an edge weight. But I just wanted to explain with the examples where the edge weight represents the actual ratios of the areas, not the monetary offers.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, with that in mind, the goal of the hypergraph here is to optimize the initial graph, to basically reduce certain areas and to effectively remove certain edges from the initial graph and to end up with a simple graph. So with all that, my final algorithm is shown here. I would first define the hypergraphs as I already explained. Then I would sort all hyperedges by weight. And then I would just go one by one, and for each hyperedge that is below a specified limit, which can be specified either by the system itself or by the interested party who made the bid, I would reduce the areas where allowed, and I would effectively end up simplifying the initial graph. So if we reduce the area of A and end up without any overlaps, then there are now no more edges between A and B, and both A and B can have spectrum sublicenses assigned. After that, I would reduce the hypergraph back to a regular graph so that I can effectively perform the maximum weighted independent set algorithm. So it's also important to know that MWIS itself.
Is this optimal at all, or is this like a heuristic?
It's a heuristic. So
yeah, okay.
It's all heuristic.
Yeah. Okay.
It is MWIS itself is an NP-hard problem, so the solution to it is also heuristic. And the way I implemented it is to use several methods of determining MWIS and simply picking the best one every time. Depending on the heuristics and the graph design, the solutions would sometimes be the same and sometimes they would be different, actually. And finally, I just want to show how I built the simulations and assessed this approach. So I built a set of synthetic data, and I had several geographical distributions to mimic realistic geographic topologies of interested bids. I had two main distributions. One was the uniformly scattered distribution, where all the bids were simply scattered across the entire area. And the other was where the bids were clustered into a specified number of groups. All the data generation, the hypergraph formation and optimization, reduction to another graph, and the maximum weighted independent set itself, everything was implemented in Python. And some results of my simulations. So this plot shows the improvements we get for different numbers of bids, specifically for the geographical distribution with 6 clusters. We can see that the optimization, or rather the benefits to the license holder in terms of the monetary gain are linear in terms of the number of bids. X-axis shows the number of bids, while the Y-axis shows the monetary compensation received without any optimization in red and with the hypergraph-based optimization in blue. The numbers on the Y-axis itself are just arbitrary units. The monetary offers were not really the scope of my research here, and the actual spectrum pricing. And another plot which shows the results for different distributions for a fixed number of bids, in this case, it was 20 bids specifically. I just want to explain that the number 0 doesn't really represent 0 clusters, it just represents the uniform distribution, and it was the easiest way to present all of the distributions on the same plot. And here we can see that with the higher number of clusters, our benefits actually grow. And it does sort of make sense intuitively speaking, since with a higher number of clusters, we may end up with more cases where a higher number of nodes would overlap in a single spot. And when this happens, a single area reduction would result in removing a significant number of edges from the resulting graph. Finally, this plot shows the improvements as percentage for each of the geographical distributions I used and all numbers of bids. And we can once again see that the benefits grow with the growing number of clusters, and also that the uniform distribution performs similarly to the distribution with 4 clusters. So with this, I would like to move on to the second project, which is...
Before you move to another project, can I ask a few questions?
Yeah, of course.
Can you go back to that map so I can kind of
this one
maybe start from there? Yes. So when you build this map and these circles, etc., I'm assuming you haven't considered something like a specific band, because you haven't mentioned anything. But did you think of what's the band that uses these circles? What's the power? What's the technologies? I mean, like maybe you can elaborate on these things, and maybe whoever would take over your work in the future, or if you decide to come back, maybe they can make this into a practical perspective, For example, I'd like to know, I'm working on ultra-wideband, how would ultra-wideband be a fit into some model like this, where ultra-wideband is more like an overlay technology? Do you have to license it, or,
So that was something that was taken into account in the research itself. I didn't include it in the slides for the sake of time, mostly. But the specific optimization I talked about was for a single band. each bid itself would specify the number of bands it requires, or in other words, the total bandwidth that was required. This specific project was aimed towards the CBR bands, which specified the channels as 5 megahertz wide. So all bids would be able to specify their required bandwidth in increments of 5 megahertz.
Can you remind us, CBRS is which frequencies?
It's around 3.5 gigahertz.
Okay. Okay, so for example, the UWB I care about is also at 3.5, but I'm not even considered that it can be, it's like an underlay, sort of technology, which I don't think it can even join your game of bidding,
Probably not. CBRS is now, I think it's now being operated by a 3-tier spectrum sharing framework. But in this specific case, each layer of the auction would be per single channel. And then for another channel, we would have basically a different layer of bids once again. And we can do that iteratively for as many number of channels as are not being utilized by higher tier users, basically. But yeah, the algorithm is based for optimizations within a single band.
So when you did this measurement calculations and you computed the bits and money, did you consider the actual band, the capacity of the band, the bandwidth, and all these things?
The bands are in CBRS already defined to be 5 megahertz, so I can't change that. That is policy.
But for the given bandwidth, then you have a given capacity and the number of bits, right? Is that the level you studied this?
My assumption was that each bid would specify the total required bandwidth. And then I would go band by band. Basically, the first iteration of the auction would be for a single band, and the next iteration of the auction would be for another band, and so on.
Yep.
For every bid that requires specifically more than one band, that is also taken into account. So the algorithms can be more complex. This is not part of the presentation, but it is mentioned in the paper itself.
Okay, thank you.
So after the first project, I would like to move on to the implementation of a wireless physical layer that was done for the purposes of the DARPA Spectrum Collaboration Challenge. So just a bit about the challenge itself. First, it was designed by DARPA. It started in the year 2016, I believe, and lasted for 3 years, where teams were basically motivated to build an entire full stack radio network. And then these radio networks would compete with each other for throughput. This particular challenge was designed to be cooperative. So teams were not only motivated to maximize their own throughput, but also to cooperate with others and to allow other networks to achieve the throughput they need. So there were points awarded for sort of the team spirit and the ensemble throughput. And the physical layer that we built for this challenge was built as a separate application, an independent application, which was then implemented as part of the full stack radio and communicated with other layers of the radio we had. Some aspects of the physical layer are that it utilized UHD, which is the USRP hardware driver, to interact with the USRP device itself and to transmit and receive waveforms. Significant adaptations were required with the UHD, and that was a large part of the engineering effort here. And on the other side, the physical layer used 0MQ as the pub/sub messaging protocol to communicate with higher layers. Specifically, in the case of physical layer, there was the MAC layer, and also the AI layer, which was responsible for determining spectrum usage and spectrum access strategy of our team. So in the implementation, we heavily utilized the RF NOC capability of UHD. This is RF network on chip. And it is a functionality that basically allows developers to build custom FPGA blocks, which would be integrated into the radio's digital signal processing chains and to provide specific functionality. And the benefit is twofold. Mainly, it would improve the performance of the signal processing blocks themselves compared to just running them in software. And it also helps with CPU offloading, basically allowing the CPU, giving it more power to deal with other things of the radio. UHD had to be heavily adapted to provide this functionality, the RFNOC functionality, to our waveforming library, which was based on the SRSLT library, which was built for the C language and needed to be fully adapted to use objects from C++ that were used for the RFNOC. So some of the specific RFNOC blocks that we utilized in this challenge are mainly the two of them that are the most important are the FIR filters that helped us reducing out-of-band emissions, and the FFT averaging in time, which basically provided a compressed image of spectrum utilization in the entire available spectrum. And this data was fed to the AI layer to for training and prediction purposes, and to basically determine our own spectrum access strategy. And some of the benefits and results we have are shown here. So this shows how out-of-band emissions are filtered out using FIR filter FPGA blocks. So the left plots show the spectrum utilization without out-of-band emissions, and then the right plots show it when the out-of-band emissions are filtered out. And we can see that spectrum utilization in the same band can be significantly larger, or alternatively, while utilizing the same band, we allow other users to use the spectrum more efficiently and closer to us in terms of the frequency distances. These are the throughputs we achieved for different kind of bandwidths. So while I have no baseline to show here because I don't have access to the achievements of other teams, we can say that, for example, for 9 megahertz, we were able to reach more than 90 megabits per second, and we were relatively close to the channel limit in this case. Yes?
So, Dragoslav, you go back a few slides just to show the block diagram of the FIR.
This one?
Yeah, so right, so the FPGA, right? You go one more slide just to sort of understand better. Okay, so let's say you programmed the FIR, for example, did you?
Well, I was programming the UHD functionality that utilized the FIR block and provided it as an API to other layers of our.
So did that entail you running Verilog, VHDL, or C++, or what did it entail?
So the block itself was built in VHDL. I did not work on that specific portion. I worked on the C++ portion where the VHDL block, basically its specifications were translated into C++ so that it can be used as a C++ object. And then I worked further on adapting that to be able to be used by a C library, the SRSLT library built in C, which was used for our actual waveforming.
Okay. And I mean, when you show that picture, go a few more slides later.
This one or
the next one, yeah, the next one. Yeah, it looks like a really nice cleaning up. And do you remember what was the interference that was out of band?
Well, the interference, do you mean in terms of SNR?
Yeah, SNR, also the physics behind what was the interference coming from?
Well, it's simply the out-of-band emission. So OFDM as a waveform is not spectrally efficient, so to speak. So it's the second lobes of the OFDM in the frequency analyzer are significantly higher than for some other modulation schemes. So this is something we were attempting to remove and to basically increase the efficiency of our physical layer.
Okay. So this was the software-defined radio basically induced, or was it coming from something else?
No, the OFDM itself physically has these higher second and third lobes. It's just a characteristic of the OFDM waveform itself.
But if you look at the graph on the left, it looks more than that. I don't know.
No,
Maybe
it's actually not.
It's not, okay.
It's just you know, the second and other lobes of the OFDM itself. It's
So if you did this simulation in Simulink, you get the same thing. That's what you're saying, or in MATLAB?
Yes, that is what I'm saying. Assuming
okay,
it's Simulink, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So some other results we had, this plot shows the packet reception rate for different signal types. And by signal types, I mainly mean the synchronization control and data signals that we used as part of our physical layer. The main point of the plots here is to show the SNR, which is required to achieve a 100% reception rate for different bandwidths and different signal types. And finally, we used the carrier frequency offset estimation based on cycle prefixes. While there was some work on this method before our implementation, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first actual implementation of such work. And the results are shown here with using more OFDM symbols with more cyclic prefixes. We achieve better estimation and reduce the error further, but it also comes at the expense of processing time.
So can you explain the y-axis on the diagram? I guess I can't.
Oh, it's the estimation error basically. It's shown as percentage, but in a logarithmic scale.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, with the higher number of cyclic prefixes, the estimation error in terms of percentages goes down. And finally, I want to say that this physical layer was a team effort, and all the design is, it's a process that was, all team members were contributing to the design of the entire physical layer. But I just wanted to specify my personal contribution in this project. I won't go over them one by one, but they are all listed here. And I would now like to move on.
So a quick clarification, Dragoslav. So what would you state as sort of the biggest learning or the sort of problem that you initially did not know you have to solve when you set out to do this? Was there a difficult problem that you had to address and sort of solve and implement?
So
decidedly, this is a great systems work, and this actually not only was implemented and you participated in the major competition and had good success. So that is a remarkable sort of deep amount of work there, no doubt, I think. But I just wanted to sort of, now that you have finished the work, step back and take a look what would be the most important challenge in your judgment. So, and of course, you can answer this at the end of the meeting. That's fine. We can go through the rest of the talk first if you prefer.
I'm happy to answer it right now. I would say my biggest takeaway is that while there is a lot of theoretical perspectives on how to build a physical layer, but actually implementing it physically just sort of forces you into so many other intricacies of this implementation. Many of these, specific individual singular solutions that need to now be made to work together. And all of these aspects have many different options. And between all of these options, we have to choose sometimes the most efficient one, sometimes the one that just fits better in our system or is more feasible to implement. And I would say that is my main takeaway, to sort of understand that in such a large system, we need to have a balance and a deeper understanding of each singular contributions to sort of make them all actually work together in a practical scenario.
Okay. Yeah, I had some other questions. We'll reserve it to the end. I think let's go through the rest of the stuff first.
So the next project is still related to the DARPA Spectrum Challenge, and specifically it's related to the spectrum coordination protocol that was designed for the DARPA Challenge. I will talk a little bit about this protocol and how I assessed its efficiency and the benefits that were derived from it. So there is some existing work on protocols that would help networks coexist in the same spectrum. This work includes several different areas, such as using rendezvous protocols to form information exchanging groups, which would then propagate this information further to other groups. There are protocols focused on optimizing some existing wireless communication protocols to be more coexistence friendly, so to speak. And then there are simply spectrum etiquette protocols. What is valid for all of this work is that, to the best of our knowledge, all of it was completely theoretical. None of it was actually implemented and used. And the CIL, DARPA's CIRN Interaction Language, was the first actual implementation of such coordination protocol. So I already explained the DARPA challenge itself, but now to talk a little bit about the protocol. It was designed as a language which enabled different networks to coordinate, to communicate with each other, to exchange messages related to their spectrum usage. And sort of like poetically, it was built as a collaborative, cooperative effort of all teams. During the years of the challenge, we had multiple meetings where many different design choices were presented, and then it was an evolution that led to a CIL that was finally built the way it was. And a bit more about the functionality of the CIL itself. So for each network, there would be only one node, the sort of a gateway node that has access to CIL, and then it's the responsibility of the network itself to further propagate this information received from the CIL to other nodes within the same network. The networks, or the CIRNs, the Collaborative Intelligent Radio Networks, were able to announce their intended spectrum usage by sending a spectrum voxel message. And a spectrum voxel is basically a data structure that defines the frequency bands that are used in transmission, the entire bandwidth, the transmission time, duty cycle power, and many other parameters of the transmission. CIL was also able to allow networks to exchange requests for spectrum availability. And another interesting functionality of CIL was to basically allow networks to request help for reaching isolated nodes. So if a network has a single node that can't be reached by other nodes within the same network, then this network is allowed to ask other networks through CIL to help it reach this isolated node. So while CIL was definitely used successfully during the entire challenge, we don't really know how effective it really was. There was no framework for the verification. There was no way to simply turn it off and rerun the experiment with the same scenario. So while we can assume that it was helpful, we don't really know how much. So I decided to build a relatively simple wireless communication system where I would establish this metrics and attempt to quantify the benefits of CIL. So my verification system is based on a set of very naive radio networks. So every network is constituted just of a transmitter-receiver pair. The transmissions were all made in discrete time slots. All channels that were used were selected randomly. And the main metric that I cared about was the ensemble throughput. I ran the experiments for different numbers of transmitter-receiver pairs for different numbers of available channels. And I ran all of them, the same scenarios with and without the usage of CIL. So without the usage of CIL, every network or every transmitter would always transmit in the channel that it selected. While with CIL, there would be a probability of backing off depending on the number of other networks that picked the same channel in this specific time slot. So even with this very simple system, I noticed some benefits. But before I get to that, yes.
Dragos, can you elaborate on how did the probability depend on CIL? Like, and what's the protocol like? On this picture, like one color, another color, and then I broadcast my CIL, and then somebody says, "Okay, you're using that. You know, I'm not going to use it." Like, how did it work?
So the transmitters were shown on the left here, and receivers on the right, and the color of the arrows just indicate the channel that was selected. So same color, same channel, different colors, different channel. And the backoff algorithm was relatively simple. So with CIL, network would announce the channel they intend to use in the upcoming time slot. And with this knowledge, every transmitter would, if there are n channels, other n transmitters total using the same channel, every transmitter would only transmit with probability 1/n. So it is a very simple backoff algorithm, which would, reduce the probability of collisions.
So let me, I guess, understand this. So, right. So CIL lets you project into the future what the transmitter is going to do.
It's
right? So instead of a reactive thing like CSMA, it's more proactive, I guess?
It is proactive in the sense that networks will tell other networks, hey, I'm planning to use this specific frequency with this specific bandwidth in 50 milliseconds. So other networks can plan around this. And
but did they do any other planning, or was just if there's a probable collision that I might back off? I think that's what the algorithm was that you used.
So in my case, that was the algorithm. So I just wanted to have but this is just the specific case of my verification system, which was mainly built for simplicity, but to sort of have an idea of how much we can benefit if we have this information. For the DARPA challenge itself, CIL had the functionality to exchange different kinds of messages. So networks could request spectrum availability, like, hey, I really need spectrum in 100 milliseconds, please make it available for me. And then these requests could be rejected or accepted and so on. So it was, in reality, a more complex protocol, but I was focusing on only a few aspects of it.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It just seems like a kind of a forward in time. It's not exactly CSMA. I mean, CSMA is reactive, but it's more proactive. But it's just probabilistic whether it tries to grab the channel or not. So,
Yes. In the case of my verification, yes, it's probabilistic. But the probabilities are based on the information received from other networks.
Right, you're scaling the probability by the demand, right?
Yes, exactly. So a bit more details about my implementation is that transmitters and receivers were built using GNU Radio. And for the physical layer itself, the USRP devices were used, and it was all run on the Orbit Wireless testbed. I had 500 runs with and without CIL both for all the numbers of transmitter receiver pairs, and everything was assumed to be in the same collision domain. So there was no geographical components, no isolated nodes to simplify the experiments. And before I get to actual results, I want to show a specific scenario that I deemed interesting.
So how many nodes?
So the number of nodes was varying from 8 to 40. And the main experiment included 32 available channels. So I had between 8 and 40 nodes in 32 channels.
And then you would run this kind of like randomly, and then each time you run, you would change the pair, or how do you, like, what's the process?
I would run it randomly every time. So all nodes would randomly select their channels in every run.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, the interesting scenario.
So Dragoslav, just quick question. So what are the number of available channels? How big is the universe for the random?
So in my experiments, I used 32 available channels. That is the main one that I'm showing here. I played around with other experiments, but I just determined that I'm going to show the results for a specific number of available channels, which is 32. But this is not based on an actual network, or actual spectrum. This is just a showcase of how useful CIL can be in certain scenarios. So it can be any number of actual channels depending on the actual spectrum that we would use CIL in. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I think I'm just trying to understand if something like this is done in practice, what is the swath of the bandwidth over which the channelization is done, and therefore the number of channels available for this kind of approach. Yeah. So
I think that would highly depend on the spectrum we want to use CIL in. But yeah, in my experiments, it was specifically 32 channels, or at least the experiments that I show in this presentation. So yeah, to go back to the interesting scenario, here on the right on the plots, we can see 5 consecutive time slots. And the top plot shows the channels that were selected by each network. So the y-axis is simply different channels, whereas the x-axis is time. And then the bar plots, the lower 4 plots, show the achieved throughput of each particular network. And the interesting portion here is time slots 4 and 5, where both blue and green networks randomly selected the same channel. And then in time slot 4, we can see that the blue network randomly decided not to transmit, while the green network decided to transmit and achieve maximal throughput because there was no interference. And then, I mean, something we already knew, but this experiment confirms it. When they both randomly decided to transmit, they did have some throughput, but almost negligible. And this shows the importance of cooperation and backing off and how it can actually help the ensemble throughput. And finally, some of the achieved improvements. The blue line shows the results without CIL, while the red line shows the results with using CIL. And the numbers are shown, the y-axis shows the percentage of maximal throughput achievable in an ideal scenario between each pair of transmitters and receivers. These plots show the results for 8, 16, 20, and 40 nodes. So the different number of transmitter and receiver pairs. And we can see that with higher pairs, the total throughput, the higher number of pairs, the total throughput tends to be lower, obviously, as the spectrum is more congested, but also the benefits of CIL end up being higher. And the final benefits in terms of percentage are go from 4 to 12% in total achieved throughput. One other interesting factor is that the variance in this throughput also changed. And in the next slide, I will show how it changed. So for the lower number of nodes, we can see that CIL, which is shown in red, actually helped reduce the variance. So the systems were overall more stable, less variable. And with the higher number of nodes, CIL actually increased the variance. So the system was less stable. But this can also be interpreted by saying that without CIL, with a very high number of nodes in the same spectrum, the results were consistently bad, while CIL actually helped them be significantly better in certain experiments. And also, it's important to say that the highest variance without CIL was achieved in 32 channels with 24 nodes, while with CIL, it was with 32 nodes, which is the exact same number as the number of channels. So it sort of also indicates some kind of optimality here. And I will now move on to the next project, which is a very
so Dragoslav, just a question on this. So maybe you said it already. There was no geographic considerations, right?
No. All nodes were assumed to be in the same collision domain.
Right. So basically, like, when you run this, everything was. There was no clustering involved, right?
No. All nodes could see all other nodes.
Okay. So like, because maybe an interesting question for someone else who looks at this is sort of, you would think that networks, if they kind of, are really networks, they would have some separation. So one question would be, when does, at which separation does CIL, and what kind of separation CIL matters, and when it doesn't matter?
So interestingly enough, my following project that I will talk about deals with almost exactly that.
Okay. You mean the next set of slides?
Yes, the next set of slides, yes.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, as I said, the next project is sort of a logical evolution of the previous one, where CIL was enhanced to use the spectrum consumption model messages. The spectrum consumption models, or SCMs, are an IEEE standard that was defined to very precisely describe spectrum usage by both transmitters and receivers. It includes several spectrum parameters, such as the spectrum mask for the transmitter or the underlay mask for the receiver, the transmitted or the required power, the transmitting schedule, policy, and many other parameters. And one other important aspect of SCMs is that they standardized compatibility calculations between transmitters and receivers. So with an SCM message from a transmitter and a receiver, we could just plug them into a formula and immediately know whether these transmitter and receiver would be compatible with each other in the same spectrum. And that is shown on this slide, where the left plot shows the spectrum mask of a transmitter, the right plot shows the underlay mask of a receiver, and along with other spectrum usage parameters that would be available in an SCM message, we are able to relatively simply calculate whether this particular transmitter and receiver would be compatible and whether they can exist in the same spectrum or not. So just a bit about the architecture of the system we built for these experiments. We had 4 layers. The first layer was the spectrum service cloud layer, which was dealing with calculations, the coordination, and it was used to run the CIL itself. We have the wireless domain controller layer, in which each node had a smart designated, each network had a smart designated node, which served as the controller. And it was sort of like a gateway node to exchange CIL messages and to determine the spectrum usage of each particular network. We had the wireless data plane, which just represents the layer in which the wireless communications were actually performed. And finally, the monitoring plane, which represents a set of independent spectrum sensors that were used for unbiased spectrum measurements. For these experiments, we designed a protocol where we have several types of messages that can be exchanged using CIL. We have some basic types of messages, such as register and form messages, which are used when each network joins the collision domain. And in terms of the SCM messages themselves, the most important one would be the SCM message and an SCM request, where nodes can communicate and ask for SCM messages and then use that to calculate their compatibility. And a little bit on the results of the experiment. So we have 3 plots, which are 3 different moments in time. And just to explain the plots, the upper half of the plot is the current spectrum usage, while the lower half of the plot is basically a waterfall plot where the x-axis is frequency, the y-axis is time going downwards, and the color represents the power currently present in the spectrum. So at time 1, we have a single network utilizing the spectrum. At time 2, the second network joins, notifies the regional topology manager, or basically the cloud spectrum service. Other nodes are now aware that another network is joining, and they send their SCM messages. And the new network uses these SCM messages to calculate whether it can utilize the spectrum it intended. And if not, it finds an available chunk of spectrum and starts its transmission there. In time 3, the same thing happens with the third network. It finds an available chunk of spectrum and uses it for its transmission. This was all happening in real time with real radios, where they were using the actual SCM messages based on the measurements we did to determine and specifically define the SCM messages for each particular transmitter and each particular signal type. Finally, I would like to talk about the last project I worked on, which is another layer of assessing the spectrum utilization efficiency, and it was focused on using prediction. And most specifically, it was predicting spectrum usage in short term, or rather assessing the effectiveness of short-term predictions of spectrum availability. The motivation behind this was already mentioned, but just to reiterate, most current spectrum sensing methods are reactive. Collaboration is one attempt to make them proactive, but without collaboration, can a single network build its own prediction and get an accurate picture of when and which spectrum will be available in the short-term future? And why I'm focusing on short-term so much is because there is already a lot of work dealing with long-term prediction, and it's also intuitive. It's easy to say that there will be a lot more spectrum users in an office building at 3 p.m. than at 2 a.m. But that doesn't really help with immediate spectrum usage, where we would need information on whether a certain channel will be used in the next 100 or 200 milliseconds. So for the prediction, I used LSTMs, as they are neural network architecture that is particularly well suited for prediction. And they are shown to perform very well with time series predictions. In fact, there is a thesis recently published at Rutgers that uses this particular library shown in the fourth bullet point for traffic prediction. So I deemed that these would be this would be the right architecture to assess spectrum usage in short term. And I want to show some of my results. So the first conclusion is the signal periodicity obviously helps with accurate prediction. Even then, even when we have a periodic signal, and all of these four signals shown here are periodic, we still need to finely tune the parameters of the neural network to achieve good and accurate prediction. All of these plots show the real signal, and then on top of the real signal, short-term predictions are shown in sequence. And on the lower left plot, we see a badly tuned network where the predictions immediately become less accurate, even though the signal is fully periodic. When we move to random signals, then we can see that the prediction is not much better than guessing. So it is not very reliable to use in a real world scenario with a lot of random signals. Another experiment which shows on the top, there is a random signal present in the spectrum, and in the lower plots, there is a periodic signal present in the network, and the signals and their predictions are shown on the leftmost plots, while the middle and right plots show the results of basically the ensemble throughput of other networks trying to utilize the spectrum around this incumbent signal. The middle plots show the ideal possible throughput based on either an hypothetical oracle of spectrum usage or based on using CIL to coordinate spectrum access and inform other networks about intended spectrum usage. And then the rightmost plots show the actual achieved throughput using just prediction. And we can see that while the periodic signal can be worked around, in the case of a random signal, the results were not very good. However, it is still important to note that many real-world signals have predictive components, so either beacons that are transmitted periodically or protocols that tend to use the spectrum with a given pattern, such as Bluetooth with its specifically defined frequency hopping. So there are scenarios where prediction can be successfully used.
Yeah, so Dragos, I don't know if you saw the chat. Oh, you haven't concluded. Yeah, we need to wrap up in maybe like.
Oh yeah. This is the conclusion, so I'm getting to the end.
Wade has to. We need some time for the closed session. So.
Yeah. Okay. So to just finalize with my conclusions, I presented several different perspectives of spectrum utilization efficiency improvements from several different layers. So just to try to be as fast as possible. I showed some policy-driven improvements in the three-tier spectrum sharing with the secondary spectrum markets. I show how helpful and efficient actual implementation of physical layer can be, how much a coordination protocol can help networks coordinate spectrum access. That was enhanced with a real-world experiment using this coordination protocol to exchange standardized spectrum usage messages. And I talked a bit about scenarios in which prediction can and may not be helpful in spectrum usage. And I would say my final conclusion based on all this work was that the research community should move more towards the hybrid approaches. So I believe that we would need more papers where more than one of these approaches would be used in concurrency. So we want to see how they can work together and how these benefits would be shown when multitude of these approaches are used at the same time. And with that, I'm just going to wrap up with a list of relevant publications. And thank you, everyone, especially my advisor, Professor Treppi, for all your patience and guidance. Thank you, committee members, for all your help. I learned a lot from you during my work with all of you. And thank you to all my friends and colleagues from WinLab, both professionally and personally. You helped me a lot in my life, and all my friends, both here in the US and back in Serbia, and especially my family, most of all. And I would like to give special thanks to Ivan, who at this point is basically the embodiment of WinLab, and who helped me a lot, really a lot during my research. So that will be all.